She was 9 years old, standing inside a turf-walled byre, while a winter gale bent the valley flat. Sheep breathed warm clouds against the stone. Soot from the lamp above left a taste like burnt iron on her tongue. Outside, the wind hit the farmhouse, and the farmhouse groaned, shutters banging, ridge beam creaking, snow hissing through the eave gaps. But inside the byre, the sheep did not flinch. The turf walls did not move. Her mother pressed a palm against the damp surface and said, "The roof is not on the house. The roof is part of the hill." 20 years later, on a treeless Nebraska tableland with winter 6 weeks away, that sentence was the only blueprint she had, and 2 children were depending on it. Custer County, Nebraska sat 15 miles northwest of Broken Bow, on a stretch of open tableland where the Loop Divide rolled south toward the river breaks. In late August of 1887, the grass still held green in the draws, but the upland had already gone the color of old rope. A woman stood at the edge of a quarter section she had never expected to own. Ragna Brecka was 31 years old. She had 2 children. She had a dead husband. And she had 160 acres of treeless prairie that the United States government would give her for free, provided she could live on it, improve it, and survive long enough to prove she had done both. Oddman Brecka had filed the claim 6 months earlier, paying the land office fee with money borrowed against a freight contract. He had chosen a south-facing rise at the northwest corner of the section because it broke the wind from the north and caught winter sun. He was a careful man who measured before he cut. He had loaded his wagon with cottonwood poles from the south loop bottoms and started building a shelter on that rise. He was going to give his family a home on ground that belonged to them. He died on the third haul. The wagon tongue caught a rut, slipped its pin, and swung sideways into his chest. The impact cracked 4 ribs and collapsed his left lung. He breathed in a shallow rattle for 2 days in the back of the wagon while the hired driver turned the team around. By the time they reached the claim, Oddman could no longer speak. He died with Ragna holding his hand and Eli, 8 years old, pressing a wet cloth to his forehead. Petter, who was 4, stood beside the lame ox and watched the stillness settle over his father's face without understanding what it meant. Ragna buried him on the rise, 60 feet north of the half-built wall that was supposed to become their house. Eli helped dig. The soil was sandy over clay, and it took them most of a day. When they finished, Ragna drove a cottonwood stake into the mound and said nothing, because the words she had were in Norwegian, and they were not meant for Nebraska. The land office rules did not bend for grief. The claim required residence, cultivation, and visible improvement within 5 years. Oddman's death did not cancel the filing. Under the Homestead Act, a widow could hold and prove the claim in her own name, but the law did not frame the walls. The law did not raise the roof. The law did not stop the winter that was already circling the calendar, and Ragna knew, in the way that anyone who has spent a winter on open ground knows, that Nebraska's cold did not negotiate. She took inventory on the 3rd morning after the burial, writing the figures in the margin of Oddman's freight ledger with a pencil stub. $32 in coin, 2 sacks of flour, 1 opened, 1 milk cow, sound, 1 ox, lame in the right foreleg, a crosscut saw, a breaking plow she could not pull without a full team. 47 cottonwood poles stacked beside the half wall, most of them crooked, some still green enough to weep sap. 1 cast iron stove with a short pipe and no chimney draw. 1 half-built wall, 16 feet of sod, 2 courses thick, standing 3 feet high. No corners, no frames, no roof. Ragna closed the ledger. That was all of it. That was everything between her children and the open sky. Asa Whitcomb arrived on the 4th day. He was 64 years old, a former Army carpenter who had framed officers' quarters at Fort McPherson and storm sheds along the military road before the railroad made the forts unnecessary. He had settled on the Loop Divide in 1879 and built houses for 3 families that were not his own, charging nothing when the family had nothing to charge. He walked with a cane cut from bois d'arc wood, and he used it the way other men used a pointing finger to measure, to judge, to punctuate a verdict. He had buried 2 wives. He understood what the ground took and what it left behind. Nobody sent him. He came because he had seen the freight driver on the Broken Bow Road and counted the days since. Ragna was stacking sod blocks against the base of the half wall, trying to shore up a course that had started to lean, which when she heard the cane tapping the hardpack. She looked up. Asa stood at the northeast corner of the claim, studying the site the way a surgeon studies a wound before deciding whether to cut or close. He walked the length of the half wall without greeting her. He measured it with his eyes, not guessing, but reading the dimensions the way a man reads familiar handwriting. At the far end, he tapped the top course with his cane. A chunk of root mat the size of his fist broke loose and fell to the ground. "Who laid this?" he asked. "My husband," Ragna said, "before he died." Asa nodded. He walked to the pole stack and pulled one cottonwood log free. He sighted down its length, set it back, and pulled another. He did this with 4 poles. He did not like any of them. Then he walked to the stove, examined the pipe joint, and tapped the iron base with his cane. The stove rang hollow. "Mrs. Brecka," he said, "I'm going to tell you what I see, and I need you to hear all of it before you answer." Ragna set down the sod block. Eli appeared at the edge of the lean-to, watching. "You have half a frame," Asa said. He pointed the cane at each item as he named it. "You have maybe 1.5 cords of burnable wood in that pole stack, and I am being generous because some of those are still green and will smoke more than they heat. You need 6 cords minimum for a winter. That stove will draw, but only if you build a proper chimney run with a fire break, and you have no brick, no clay pipe, and no stone for a hearth. You have no roof, you have no ridgepole. Nothing in that pile is straight enough or strong enough to span 16 feet. You have no door frame, you have no window frame, you have no floor. You have a breaking plow, but no team to pull it. You have 40-some poles that a carpenter would reject for fence rails." He said all of this without raising his voice. He said it the way a man reads a bill of lading, item by item, total at the bottom, the sum already known before the counting is done. A proper square cabin on this ground needs a full timber roof, a front door with a hung frame, 2 windows, and 6 cords of fuel stacked under cover before first snow, he continued. You need boards, nails, tarred felt, and freight to haul it all. Rusk will quote you $71 for what you need, and he will add $12 for hauling because he adds $12 for everybody. "I have $32, Ragna said. Asa looked at the cow grazing the draw below the rise. He looked at Eli standing at the lean-to with Pater leaning against her hip. "If you sell the cow, you lose the milk, and your boy needs milk," he said. "If you sell the claim, Dillard Rusk buys it at the price of your freight debt, and you know what that price is. If you leave, I cannot leave." Ragna's voice was flat, not angry, flat, the way a board is flat when it has been planned past the grain. "I have no return passage. My parents are dead. I have no family east of the Missouri. Every dollar my husband earned is either in that poll stack or in the land office register. If I leave this ground, I leave with 2 children, no money, and no law that protects the work already sunk." Asa planted the cane. "I know you cannot leave, Mrs. Brecka. That is why I am standing here instead of sitting at home." He looked at the half wall one more time. Ragna could see him building the cabin in his mind, the cabin that should have been the square and plumb structure with tight corners and a proper gable roof and windows that caught the morning light. He could see it, and she could see it, and neither of them could pay for it. I have built houses on this divide for 11 years, Asa said. A house stands because its corners stand square. Good sod, good timber, good iron at the joints. You do not have corners. You do not have lumber for corners. And I will say this plain. A woman alone, with one lame ox and 2 children, cannot raise a conventional roof frame before hard frost. The wind pushed through the grass behind him. It was a warm wind still, an August wind with nothing behind it yet. But the direction was northwest, and on the Lou Divide, northwest was where the killing weather lived. When does hard frost come? Ragna asked. 6 weeks, maybe 7 if God is feeling generous. But the ground freezes before the air does, and once the ground freezes, you cannot cut sod, you cannot set posts, and you cannot trench a foundation, so you have less than 6 weeks to do what most men with money and a full team take 8. He turned and walked back toward the road. At the edge of the claim, he stopped and turned halfway. I am not telling you to quit, he said. I am telling you what I see, and what I see is not yet a house. He left. The cane tapped the hard pack in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Ragna stood beside the half wall and pressed her hand against the sod. The surface was still warm from the afternoon sun. Inside the packed earth, the heat lingered the way warmth lingered in the walls of her mother's byre in Hardanger, that particular deep warmth that came not from fire, but from mass, from the weight of soil holding what the air tried to spend. She had known that feeling her whole life. She had stood against dirt walls as a child and felt warmer than she felt beside a stove. But knowing a feeling and knowing how to build with it were separated by a distance she could not yet cross. She had never framed a roof. She had never laid a proper sod course with lintels and settling gaps and drainage. Her husband had done the building while she managed the provisions, the children, and the accounts. Now the provisions were short, the children were frightened, and the account showed $32 against a debt that grew every day she did not act. That night she fed Eli and Peter cornbread cooked on the stove grate in open air. The smoke drifted sideways and would not rise. Peter coughed and buried his face in Ragna's skirt. Eli ate slowly, watching the sky darken from the west. When will the roof be finished? Eli asked. Ragna looked at the half wall. She looked at the poles. She looked at the empty space above them where a roof was supposed to be. When I figure out what the roof is, she said. The answer did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a sequence of failures that, one by one, closed every door except the one nobody wanted to open. The first failure came in early September. A windstorm hit the divide after sundown. Not a dangerous storm, just a hard northwest blow that lasted 4 hours. It tore the canvas sheet from the lean-to. Ragna had staked the canvas at 4 corners and weighted the bottom edge with sod blocks. The storm ripped 2 stakes clean and snapped the canvas like a whip until the southeast corner shredded into strips. But where the canvas had lain flat against the haystack behind the lean-to, pressed tight to the curved surface, no gap, no loose edge, it held. The ropes were intact. The grass beneath was dry. Only the parts that caught the wind had torn. Ragna stood in the wreckage at dawn with canvas strips in her hands. She looked at the haystack. The wind had not moved it. The hay sat round and dense and close to the ground, and the wind had gone over it the way water goes over a river stone, parting, passing, closing again on the other side. She held that image. The second failure came that same night. The cook stove smoked. It smoked whenever the northwest wind hit the half wall, because the wall was a flat face that caught the moving air and deflected it downward into the stove opening. The draft reversed. Smoke filled the lean-to. Ragna moved the pipe. The smoke followed. She stuffed twisted grass into the gaps between sod courses. The wind found new gaps. It always found new gaps, because a flat wall with edges was a shape the wind could grip, and gripping meant pressing, and pressing meant finding every weakness in the surface. Eli coughed and asked the question that unlocked everything. Why can wind get inside a house? Ragna looked at her daughter. The question was simple. The answer was the shape of a house itself. Wind got inside because a box gave it edges to grab and faces to press against and cracks to lever open. A square cabin with 4 walls and a peaked roof was a shape that fought the wind, and on the loop divide, the wind was stronger than any box that $32 could build. That night, after the children slept, Ragna sat beside the cooling stove and let the memories surface. She was 9 years old, standing in her mother's byre in Hardanger. The byre sat against a hillside with its rear wall half buried in slope. The roof was covered in turf that grew the same grass as the pasture above it. Sheep pressed against the inside walls, and their breath warmed the air, and the walls held that warmth the way a stone holds the heat of a summer day. But what Ragna remembered was the storm. She remembered standing outside during a winter gale and watching the wind hit the farmhouse, the proper wooden farmhouse with its peaked roof and painted trim, and hearing it groan. Shutters banged, the ridge beam creaked, snow drove through the eave gaps and dusted the floor inside. Then she had looked at the byre. The wind ran over the byre as if it were not there. The turf did not move. The walls did not groan. The sheep inside stood calm, chewing, undisturbed. The byre was not a building fighting the wind. The byre was part of the hill, and the wind did not fight hills. The wind went over hills. Her mother had pressed a palm against the turf wall. The wall was damp and cool on the surface, but warm underneath, and her mother had said the thing Ragna had carried for 20 years without knowing what it was for. The roof is not on the house. The roof is part of the hill. Ragna spread cold ash on the flat of a board. She drew with her finger, not a square cabin, not a box, a wedge. The high wall at the rear backed into the south-facing rise where Oddmund had already cut 4 feet of bank, the roof sloping down from that high rear beam toward the northwest, falling at a steady angle until the low windward edge sat close to the ground. The entry on the east, the leeward side, tucked behind a low sod wing wall that would break the wind before it reached the door. No front-facing windows. One small shuttered opening high on the south wall for daylight. The whole structure covered in sod, grass growing on the roof, roots binding the cover to the sheathing, the building disappearing into the prairie until it became the prairie, 16 by 20 feet inside. Rear wall 4 feet into the bank, side walls 2 feet thick. A roof plane running roughly 26 feet from the high rear beam to the low windward toe, pitched steep enough to shed snow and smooth enough to deny the wind any edge to catch. She tested the logic the only way she could. She poured a thin line of flour dust across the ash sketch and blew. When the dust hit a square sod block she had set upright to represent a conventional cabin, it swirled and eddied behind the block, trapped in the low-pressure curl. When it hit the sloped board she had propped to represent her roof angle, it rode over clean and kept going. She lit a twist of straw and held it in front of both shapes. The smoke hitting the square block curled, tumbled, and wrapped back against the face. The smoke crossing the slope streamed over in a smooth line and dissipated downwind. It was flour and smoke on an ash-covered board in the dark. It was not engineering, but it was the first thing since the wagon tongue that suggested an answer might exist inside the problem rather than beyond it. If the roof beams held, if the sod did not leak, if the posts could take the weight of wet earth. If Alma Ketchum came the next morning, walking the half-mile from her own cabin with her youngest on her hip. She was 38, a neighbor with 5 children, and a husband who ran freight between Broken Bow and Ansley for weeks at a stretch. She had brought Ragna a jar of plum preserves after the burial, and she had kept her counsel because she believed a widow deserved silence before advice. But she had seen Ragna's ash sketches propped against the pole stack to dry in the sun, and the shape drawn there was too strange to ignore. "Tell me that is not what I think it is," Alma said. Ragna showed her the board. She explained the slope. She explained the wind. She demonstrated the flower test while Alma watched with her arms folded and her youngest tugging her braid. Alma studied the sketch the way Asa had studied the half wall, walking around it, looking from every angle, not searching for reasons to believe, but searching for the flaw that would kill. "No front window," Alma said. "No light from the north or west. You are building a root cellar and calling it a home." "I will cut a south shutter. The sun crosses the south sky for hours, one opening, high, with a hinged board. A dirt roof means mud in the bed. I know this. I lived it. Every spring rain, every early melt, dirty water dripping on the flour, on the blankets, on the children's faces while they sleep. I will lay tarred paper over the sheathing boards and slope-packed clay underneath the sod so the water runs off the back, not through." "And the ceiling height," Alma said. "How tall at the low end?" 5 feet at the windward wall, 7 at the rear beam. 5 feet. Alma looked at Eli, who was carrying a water bucket up from the wash. "Your daughter is already 4.5 feet. In 2 years she crawls. You want her stooping like an old woman before she turns 11? The objections were not cruelty. They were the earned knowledge of a woman who had lived on the Loop Divide through 6 winters and watched sod roofs leak, buckle, sag, and fall. Alma had scooped mud from her own dugout with a tin cup while her baby cried in a wet cradle. She knew what dirt became when water found it. She knew what darkness did to children who spent 5 months inside without sun. Ragna felt the weight of every word. She was not dismissing Alma. She was counting costs against costs. "Rusk wants $71 for the lumber, nails, tarred felt, and freight to build what Asa says I need," Ragna said. "I have 32. If I sell the cow, my children lose milk, and Pater already coughs through the night. If I build a frame cabin with the poles I have, the roof will be too light, and the first hard blow will peel it back. If I build nothing, we freeze before Christmas." She tapped the sketch. "This is not what I want, Alma. This is what the numbers allow." Alma looked at the drawing. She looked at the children. She looked at the sky, which was the deep, empty blue that September wore on the divide, warm enough to fool you, bright enough to make you forget what came after. "If that roof leaks," Alma said, "everything under it rots. Flour, bedding, clothing, your children's lungs." "I know." "And if those beams fail under a snow load?" She stopped. The end of the sentence was that Ragna's children would be crushed beneath the weight of the structure their mother had built to save them. Alma would not say it. Ragna heard it anyway. "I know that too," Ragna said. Alma left with her jar empty and her objections unresolved. At the edge of the claim, she paused without turning around. "I will send my boys when you are ready to raise the beam. Eli should not be stacking sod blocks the size of her own body." The resistance did not wait for Ragna to build. It arrived before she had set a single new course. Dillard Rusk was 46 years old, the lumber merchant and freight agent in Broken Bow, and the quiet buyer of claims that other people could not hold. He owned the only supply of milled boards, wire nails, and tarred felt within 30 miles. He also held freight contracts with every hauler between the Platte and the Niobrara, which meant that even if you could find cheaper lumber elsewhere, you paid Rusk to move it. He was not a villain in the storybook sense. He was a man who understood that scarcity was a business, and that winter on the Lou Divide created scarcity the way a river creates current, steadily, inevitably, and in a direction that always benefited the man standing at the narrow point. When Ragna's husband died, Rusk had waited 4 days before sending a man to ask whether the widow intended to sell the claim. When Ragna said no, Rusk had waited another week. He was patient. Claims failed on their own. But when word reached Stover's store that the Breake widow was drawing sloped shapes in ash and talking about burying a house in dirt, Rusk saw a different problem. A woman who built her own shelter with prairie sod and crooked poles, even a strange shelter, even a bad one, was a woman who did not need his lumber, his nails, or his credit terms. And if one widow could do it, others might try. That was the threat he could not tolerate. He delivered his verdict at Stover's counter, loud enough for the 3 men buying coffee to hear. Mrs. Brekke means to live under a haystack and call it architecture. I give it until first hard frost before she comes to me for boards, and by then the price will be what the season demands. The line traveled. Within a week, it had mutated into local truth. Boys dared each other to run across the widow's roof site before the sod was even laid. Women at the church gathering whispered that no decent house hid its face from the road. Men on wagons slowed down when they passed the Brekke claim, watching Ragna cut sod with the lame ox, and said things they thought she could not hear. One of them, a hired hand named Emery Vale, stopped his team and stared at the half wall and the sloped bank cut and said to his partner, "She is building a mole hole with a hat pulled over its eyes." Ragna heard him. She was cutting sod 40 yards away, close enough for the wind to carry every word. She did not stop. She did not look up. She set another block, grass side down, and pressed it into the course. The mockery was not the worst of it. The worst was what mockery became on the frontier. When your neighbors laughed at your work, they stopped offering help. Nobody lent a team to a foolish project. Nobody brought a covered dish to a woman who had rejected the wisdom of men who had survived 6 winters already. Mockery was not just shame, it was isolation. And isolation in Custer County in 1887 could kill as certainly as cold. Russ confronted her directly the day she came to Stover's store to buy tarred paper. He was standing at the counter with his hat on, which meant he was there for business, not goods. When Ragna asked Stover for 2 rolls of tarred felt, Russ cut in before Stover could answer. "I believe my last 2 rolls are spoken for," Rusk said. "Reserved for houses that stand upright." Ragna set her coins on the counter. "I am paying cash." Rusk looked at the coins. "Cash does not change the reservation, Mrs. Brekke." "What changes it?" Rusk smiled the way a man smiles when he believes the arithmetic is on his side. "A proper lumber order, boards, joists, ridgepole, nails, and felt, the full list. I can extend credit against the claim if you prefer." Credit against the claim meant that if Ragna could not pay, Rusk took the land. She understood the offer. Rusk understood that she understood. The 3 men at the counter watched without speaking. "I will buy the tarred paper," Ragna said, "or I will find it in Ansley." Rusk held the smile for another moment, then shrugged. "Stover, give the woman her paper. Whatever she builds with it, it will make a fine story for the spring." Stover handed over one roll. The price was $3 above what Ragna had expected. She paid it because the trip to Ansley would cost her 2 days, and the ox could not make it. Outside the store, a man she did not know was leaning against the hitching rail. Knut Vik, 35, a widowed blacksmith with a small forge near Broken Bow. He had thick arms, a quiet manner, and a habit of watching things carefully before he spoke about them. He had been inside the store during the exchange. He had said nothing. As Ragna loaded the tarred paper into her wagon, Knut straightened up and said, "I have salvaged strap iron and angle plate from a freight wagon that broke an axle last month. If you need iron for bracing, I will sell it at weight." Ragna looked at him. "Why?" "Because I want to see whether that roof of yours can hold a promise or only dirt." He went back into the store. Ragna drove the ox home with one roll of tarred paper, a price gouged by $3 and the first offer of help that was not pity. She spent $9 on tarred paper, $8 on spikes and strap iron from Knut's forge, $6 on stovepipe. That left $9 for flour, salt, and lamp oil, $23 gone in 3 purchases. The margin was so thin now that a single broken tool, a sick animal, or an unexpected shortage would push the entire plan off a cliff with no bottom. Ragna began cutting sod the next morning. The first problem was the bank cut. She needed a clean vertical face 4 feet deep and 16 feet wide to seat the rear wall of the shelter into the south-facing rise. Odmund had started the cut before he died, but his work was only 2 feet deep and had already begun to slump. The soil was layered, wind-deposited sand over dense clay over gravel, and the sand collapsed when exposed. Ragna dug with a spade and a grub hoe, shoring the sides with cottonwood poles as she went. The sand fell twice. She cleared it and dug again. By the end of the first full day, she had moved roughly 1.25 cords of earth, and the cut was just past 3 feet. Her hands bled at the base of each finger, where the hoe handle had worn through skin that had not yet built callus for this work. Eli carried water from the wash, 1/4 mile each direction. Pater sat in the shade of the pole stack and talked to the ox, who stood with its bad leg cocked and its eyes half closed. The second problem was the sod itself. Ragna set the breaking plow behind the lame ox and cut her first strips near the wash, where the soil was dark and the grass grew tall and soft. The strips looked right, 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, the blade cutting clean. But when she lifted a 3-foot section, it came apart in her hands. The roots were shallow, thread-like, barely gripping the soil. The grass near the wash had never needed deep roots. Easy water and soft ground had made it lush and weak. She cut another row. Same failure. The blocks broke at every seam. She could not build walls with dirt that would not hold itself together. Ragna stood in the ruined trench with crumbled sod at her feet and let the panic surface. The panic she had been keeping locked behind her ribs since the morning Odmund stopped breathing. She could not cut sod. She could not build walls from what the prairie offered for free. She was a woman with an idea drawn in ash, standing in a ditch, failing at the most basic task that every homesteader on the divide had managed before her. That was when Halvor Tveit appeared. He came walking from the north along the wagon road with a canvas pack on his back, a plumb bob hanging from his belt on a leather thong, and a gait that covered ground without appearing to hurry. He was 62 years old, Norwegian-born, with hands the size of small shovels, and a beard trimmed close because long beards caught in saw teeth and plow chains. He had graded rail beds for the Union Pacific, built culverts and cattle guards across 3 territories, and laid sod walls for stock shelters from the Platte to the Niobrara. He had no wife, no claim, and no fixed destination. He had heard at a boarding house in Broken Bow that a Norwegian widow was trying to build something unusual on the Lou Divide, and he had walked 15 miles to see what unusual meant. He did not call out. He did not introduce himself. He walked to the edge of the failed sod trench and stood with his arms folded and his weight on his heels, watching Ragnar reset the plow for the fourth time. The ox leaned into the yoke. The blade caught. A strip of sod rose, held for 2 feet, and crumbled into dark clods. Ragnar slammed the plow handle against the ground hard enough to sting her palms. "You are measuring like someone who means to sleep under the answer," Halvor said. She turned. He stood at the trench edge, squinting down at her the way a man looks at a fence post that has been set in soft ground, not angry, not amused, just reading the problem. "The grass here is dropseed and foxtail," he said. "No grip, shallow root, 5-6 inches at most, and half of that is dead runners. You want buffalo grass, little blue stem, wire grass, the sod that grows on the high ground, away from the water, where the roots go down 8 inches because they fight for every drop." "I know that now," Ragnar said. "You knew it before you started. You just did not know you knew it." He unfolded his arms and pointed up the rise. "Show me where you mean to build." She climbed out of the trench and led him to the half wall. She showed him the bank cut, the pole stack, the stove sitting in open grass. She showed him the ash sketch on the board. She demonstrated the flour test, pouring dust, blowing, showing how it cleared the slope and eddied behind the block. She showed him the smoke from a lit straw twist doing the same. Halvor crouched beside the board. He ran his thumb along the slope line and then along the flat representation of the ground. He picked up one of the cottonwood poles and held it at the angle the rear beam would need to sit. He frowned. "I have built turf roofs in Valdres," he said. "I have built sod walls for stock shelters on the Platte. I have built dugouts and culverts and rail cuts with walls that hold a locomotive's weight above them." He set the pole down. "I have never built what you have drawn here, but the ground does not care what shape you give it, as long as you understand what it weighs when it is wet." "And what does it weigh?" "Enough to snap that pole like a finger bone." He stood. "Your idea solves the wind. I believe it solves the wind. But it opens a different door, and behind that door is the weight of wet earth on beams that are too thin, and if those beams bow, the roof does not leak. It falls." Ragnar waited. "Can you help me?" she asked. Halvor looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Eli hauling water up the draw. He looked at Pater sitting beside the ox. He looked at the half wall, the pole stack, the $9 tarred paper roll, the empty grassland stretching to every horizon. "I can help you not kill yourself with your own roof," he said. "That is not the same as building it for you. I am not charity, and you do not want charity. You want someone who knows what sod weighs." He dropped his pack beside the pole stack and walked up the rise, testing the ground with his boot heel every few steps. When he found a patch where the sod held firm, where his weight did not dent the surface, he knelt and grabbed a fistful of grass close to the soil and pulled. The roots came up tangled, matted, gripping soil in a dense weave that looked like coarse fabric. Dirt clung to the roots the way flesh clings to bone. "Here," he said, "cut here, 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, 3-foot lengths. Grass side down when you lay the courses, and reverse the grain every third layer so the roots lock across the seam, the old Norwegian way, the one that works." Ragnar brought the plow up the slope. The ox complained but leaned. The blade bit. The strip rose, clean, dense, heavy, and whole. She cut a 3-foot block and lifted it. It weighed 40 pounds, maybe more, and it did not crumble. The roots gripped like laced fingers refusing to let go. She carried it down to the wall line and set it on the first course, grass side down. She pressed it square against the block beside it until the edges mated and the roots began to interlock. Halvor watched. He did not carry the block for her. He watched to see if she understood the weight, because the weight was the truth of this kind of building, and if she could not carry it, she could not build with it. "We start tomorrow at first light," he said. "Bring the saw. The posts your husband cut are too thin for the load I have in mind, and we will need to double them or find cedar." That night Ragna fed the children and lay on the ground beside them under canvas. She had $23 left. She had a design that no one trusted, a half wall that an old carpenter had called insufficient, a practical neighbor who feared for her children's lungs, a lumber merchant who wanted her to fail, and a stranger with a plumb bob who had agreed to help her not die under her own roof. The wind came from the northwest and pressed through the canvas and scattered ash from the dead stove. Ragna lay still and listened. The wind was steady and patient, and it had nowhere else to be. September was burning through its days. The grass was already turning, the ox was already lame, and somewhere north of the divide, the winter was gathering its weight and beginning to lean south toward everything she had and everything she lacked. 5 weeks, maybe less. She had no room for a single wasted day. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? The next morning, Ragna was cutting sod on the upper rise before the sun cleared the east horizon. Halvor was already there, driving stakes and setting string lines where the side walls would climb. Halvor Tveit did not teach by explaining. He taught by making Ragna do things wrong until she understood why they were wrong, and then he taught her to do them right by standing beside her while she did them again. The first lesson was sod selection. On the second morning, he walked Ragna up the slope above the bank cut and made her kneel in the grass. He pulled a fistful of buffalo grass near the crest and held it up. The roots hung in a dense curtain, 8 inches long, tangled with soil and smaller root threads that gripped each other like woven cord. "Pull it apart," he said. Ragna tried. She twisted and tugged. The root mat held. She had to use both hands and her full weight before a section tore free, and even then it did not crumble. It separated in a ragged sheet, like tearing canvas. "Now this." He moved 10 feet downhill and pulled a clump of foxtail. The roots came up in a thin spray, 4 inches at most, with daylight visible between the threads. He handed it to her. She pulled it apart with 2 fingers. "Buffalo grass, little blue stem, wiregrass," Halvor said. "These live where rain is scarce and the wind dries the topsoil every day. Their roots go deep because they must. Foxtail and dropseed live where the wash gives them easy water. Their roots stay shallow because nothing forces them down." He brushed dirt from his hands. "You are building a house from grass. If the grass is lazy, the house is lazy. Cut only from the high ground." They cut sod that entire day. 12-inch wide strips, 4 inches thick, sliced with the breaking plow while the lame ox pulled and Ragna steered and Halvor walked behind, watching the depth. When a strip wandered too thin, he stopped her and made her reset. When the blade dove too deep, he tapped the plow frame with his boot and said one word: "Shallow." 3-foot blocks cut with the crosscut saw where the plow strips bent. Each block weighed 35 to 45 pounds, depending on moisture. By midday, they had cut 60 blocks. Ragna needed 300 for the side walls alone. The second lesson was laying technique. Halvor made Ragna set the first course of the west side wall while he watched from the bank cut above. She laid the blocks grass side down, which was correct. The The roots faced the earth and would eventually grip the course below, binding the wall into a single mass. But she laid every block with the grass running the same direction, like bricks in a simple running bond. Halvor climbed down and pulled the top block off the course. Every third layer reversed the grain. Turn the root direction 90 degrees so the fibers cross. Otherwise, the wall is strong in one direction and weak in the other, and the first frost heave splits it along the seam. He set the block back with the grain turned. He pressed it down until the roots began to interlock with the layer below. Then he showed her how to leave settling gaps above the door frame and the south shutter frame. Spaces stuffed with twisted grass that would compress as the wall settled, allowing the sod to sink without crushing the wooden lintels. "Sod walls settle," he said. 4 inches in the first year, sometimes more. If you frame the openings tight, the weight cracks the lintel. If you leave a gap and pack it with grass, the wall settles around the frame instead of through it. These were things Ragna could not have learned from the ash sketch. These were things that lived in Halvor's hands and in the hands of the men who had taught him, and in the turf walls of Norwegian farms that had stood for generations, not because they were clever, but because the people who built them understood that earth was not a material you shaped. It was a material you negotiated with. By the end of September, the side walls stood 3 feet high. Ragna had laid over 200 sod blocks. Her shoulders ached in the morning before she started, and they ached worse by noon, and by evening her arms trembled when she lifted Peter. The skin on her palms had split, healed, split again, and begun to thicken into a new surface that belonged to this work and not to the woman she had been before it. The third lesson was the one that nearly ended the partnership. Ragna had framed the roof structure using Oddmund's cottonwood poles. She had set 4 posts inside the shelter, one at each corner of a rectangle 8 feet by 16 feet, to carry the main beam and the purlins that would support the roof sheathing. The posts were 6 inches in diameter, peeled but not squared, set into holes she had dug 2 feet deep and packed with gravel and clay. Halvor looked at the posts on the morning of October 1st. He walked around each one. He pressed his palm against the wood and pushed. The posts held firm in the ground. They were set well. Then he looked up at the space where the roof would go. The span from the high rear beam at 7 feet to the low windward toe at 5 feet, roughly 26 feet of slope that would carry sod, clay, tarred paper, and sheathing boards. He did the math that Ragna had done, but he did it with 40 years of experience behind the numbers. "No," he said. Ragna stopped mortaring a sod joint with wet clay. "No what?" "No, these posts will not hold. Not for a dirt roof. Your cottonwood is green, Mrs. Brecky. Green wood bows under sustained load. Dry cottonwood is barely adequate. Green cottonwood is a promise you cannot keep." "They are what I have." "Then what you have is not enough." Halvor pulled his plumb bob from his belt and hung it beside the nearest post. The post was vertical. The plumb bob confirmed it. Today it stands true. In December, with 8 inches of wet sod and 3 inches of snow above the sod, this post will bow 1 inch, maybe 2. And 1 inch of bow in a post carrying 2,000 pounds means the roof is no longer a roof. It is a lever, pressing the low end into the ground and lifting the high end off the beam. That is how sod roofs fail. Not all at once. 1 inch at a time until the inch becomes a foot and the foot becomes a funeral. Ragna stared at the posts. She had spent 3 days setting them. She had dug the holes by hand in clay that fought the spade at every inch. "What do I need?" she asked. "Cedar, if you can find it. Doubled cottonwood if you cannot. 2 poles lashed and spiked together with strap iron, so one carries the load while the other prevents the bow. And 2 purlins running the length of the roof, not one. Diagonal braces at the post heads. iron straps from your blacksmith at every joint where beam meets post. I cannot afford more iron. Then you cannot afford a roof that holds. The argument lasted through the morning. Ragna had budgeted her iron carefully. $8 worth of spikes and strap from Knut Vik's forge, allocated to specific joints she had planned on the ash sketch. Halvor was asking her to double the iron work, which meant either spending money she did not have or finding iron she could not buy. Halvor did not budge. I told you I would help you not kill yourself. If I let you put that roof on those posts, I'm helping you build a trap. The children sleep under that roof. The answer is no. It was the first time he had raised his voice. Ragna heard in it not anger, but the weight of experience. The things he had seen fail. The shelters that had looked solid in October and collapsed in January. The people who had trusted wood that was not ready to be trusted. She spent 2 days finding a solution. Knut Vik, when she explained the problem, offered to forge additional strap iron brackets at cost, not free, but at the price of raw iron plus coal, which came to $2.60. Ragna paid it from the $9 she had reserved for flour, salt, and lamp oil. That left $6.40 for the rest of winter provisions. She also found 4 cedar fence posts in a collapsed corral 2 miles east, abandoned by a homesteader who had left for Omaha. She dragged them back behind the ox one at a time, each trip taking half a day. The cedar was dry, hard, and sound. Halvor tested each post by striking it with the back of an axe and listening to the ring. 2 passed. 2 were split internally, and he rejected them. She replaced them with doubled cottonwood, lashed and spiked with Knut strap iron, each pair bound so tightly that the poles could not bow independently. Halvor tested the doubled posts by hanging from the beam junction with his full weight, over 200 pounds. The posts held. He hung there for 10 seconds, swaying slightly, and dropped to the ground. "That will hold dirt," he said. "Probably." The probably was not comfort. It was honesty. No one could guarantee a structure they had never built before, but probably from Halvor Tveit was worth more than certainly from anyone else on the Lou Divide. October 8th, the calendar. The construction advanced in stages that Ragna tracked on the back of Oddman's freight ledger, each entry a date and a measurement and sometimes a problem. By October 3rd, the side walls stood 3 feet high and the rear bank wall was seated 4 feet into the rise. One post had cracked during setting, one of the doubled cottonwood pairs, and Ragna had replaced it with a single cedar post and 2 diagonal braces that Halvor designed on the spot, sketching angles in the dirt with his plumb bob string. By October 16th, the main beam was raised. This required 6 people, Ragna, Halvor, and Alma Ketchum's 4 oldest sons, who came because Alma had seen Eli carrying sod blocks the size of her own torso, and had decided that whatever she thought of the design, no 8-year-old girl should be doing the work of a grown man. The beam was a cottonwood pole 14 feet long and 8 inches thick, the straightest piece in Oddman's pile. They raised it with ropes and levers, and set it into the notched post heads at the rear wall. Halvor plumbed it, shimmed it with cedar wedges, and spiked the iron straps into place, while Ragna held the beam steady from below, her arms burning, her vision narrowing to the single point where iron met wood. The beam settled into its brackets with a sound like a door closing. Halvor stepped back and hung the plumb bob. "True. That beam moves," he said, "and I want to know about it before the roof does." He took a piece of charcoal from the stove and drew a line on each post at the point where the beam rested. If the beam sagged, the line would separate. If a post bowed, the mark would shift. It was the simplest measuring system possible. A black line on white wood that told the truth whether anyone was watching or not. By November 1st, the roof sheathing was half laid. Cottonwood poles set crosswise from high beam to low windward toe, covered with the sheathing boards Ragna had bought with Oddman's last freight payment, covered again with tarred paper laid in overlapping courses. But the tarred paper was short. The roll Rusk had sold her at a gouged price covered 2/3 of the roof surface. The remaining third, the low windward section, the part that mattered most because it faced the weather, was bare sheathing. Ragna needed 12 more feet of tarred paper, and she could not afford it, and Rusk would not sell it. Halvor solved the problem with clay. He mixed native clay with chopped grass and water until it formed a thick paste, then troweled it over the bare sheathing in a layer 1 inch thick. The clay would crack when it dried, but the sod layer above would hold it in place, and the grass fibers would bridge the cracks and slow water penetration. It was not as good as tarred paper. It was what they had. By November 10th, the sod covering was 3/4 complete. Halvor had taught Ragna the final lesson, the drainage system that separated a shelter from a grave. Behind the high rear wall, where the bank cut met the natural slope, water would collect during rain and snowmelt. If that water found the wall, it would seep through the sod, saturate the clay, and drip into the living space. In spring, it would freeze, expand, and crack the wall from inside. The solution was a trench, 2 feet deep, 1 foot wide, running the full length of the rear wall, packed with gravel from the wash, broken crockery from a smashed crock, and willow brush that would filter sediment. Below the sod roof covering, Halvor insisted on a layer of packed clay sloped at a constant angle from rear beam to low toe, so that any water reaching the clay would run downhill and off the edge instead of pooling above the sheathing. "Water is more patient than wind," Halvor said while they packed the trench. "Wind hits and leaves. Water arrives and stays. It finds the crack you missed. It waits for the frost to open it wider. It comes back in the spring and finishes what it started. If this house fails, it will not be the wind that kills it. It will be the water you did not plan for." Ragna packed the trench with gravel while Halvor sloped the clay. Eli passed them stones. Peder's cough had returned with the cold nights, and he stayed inside the partially finished shelter wrapped in blankets near the stove that now drew properly through its braced pipe. The first thin smoke rose straight into still November air, and for the first time, the structure looked like a place where people lived rather than a construction site where people labored. Then the setbacks came in a cluster, the way they always did when the margin was thinnest. The lame ox went down on November 12th. Its bad foreleg buckled while pulling sod blocks up the slope, and it fell on its side and would not rise. Ragna spent an hour coaxing it upright with oats and water and a steady voice, but the leg was done. The ox could stand, but it could not pull. She had lost her only draft animal. 2 days later, a cold rain fell for 6 hours. The bank cut behind the rear wall turned to paste. Mud slid down the slope and covered the drainage trench Ragna and Halvor had spent 2 days packing. They cleared it on hands and knees in the rain, scooping mud with bare hands, repacking gravel, shoring the bank with the last spare poles. And on November 15th, Rusk's hired hand, Emery Vale, the man who had called the house a mole hole, drove a string of loose cattle across the drying sod stacks where Ragna had set her reserve blocks to cure in the wind. The cattle trampled 40 blocks into flat broken sheets. Emery said the cattle had spooked. Ragna said nothing. She knew what she knew, and what she knew was that Rusk had sent a message. She spent 2 days cutting replacement blocks. Her palms split again. She wrapped them in strips torn from a flour sack and kept cutting. Halvor worked beside her, matching her pace block for block, but he never took over. That was the rule between them. She built her house. He kept it from killing her. The first snow fell on November 18th, before the final seam on the low windward toe was sealed. Ragna and Halvor worked through it, packing sod, pressing clay, tamping the edge where the roof met the ground until the transition was smooth enough that a hand run along it felt no lip, no edge, no gap where wind could hook a finger underneath. By November 22nd, the shelter was closed. The stove drew. The door hung on leather hinges inside the leeward windbreak. The south shutter admitted a blade of pale light that crossed the interior once a day. The roof was dark above them, low at the front, rising to the rear beam where the charcoal marks on the post stood clean and level. Halvor hung his plumb bob from the main beam and let it swing to rest. True. He checked the charcoal marks. No shift. He pressed his palm against the inside of the sod wall and held it there for 10 seconds. Warm, he said. The ground is holding heat. Outside, the wind crossed the sloped roof and kept going. It did not eddy. It did not curl. It passed over the structure the way it passed over the rise itself, because the structure was part of the rise now, and the wind had nothing to grip. But the wind that had passed was an autumn wind. The test that mattered had not come. By December 2nd, the shelter was complete. Everything that could be chinked was chinked. Everything that could be braced was braced. The stovepipe stood inside Knutvik's forged iron collar, wired to the rear beam with twisted telegraph wire. The drainage trench was clear. The sod cover had begun to grip, new grass roots threading into the roof soil, binding the cover to the sheathing boards, pulling the house closer to the prairie with every day of growth. From the road, the structure looked wrong. It looked like a long, dark wedge, the sod roof sloping from the rise until it nearly met the ground at the northwest edge. No front windows, no whitewashed boards, no peaked gable, just a dirt-covered slope with a stovepipe at the rear and a low sod wall near the east end where the door hid from the weather. A stranger passing on the wagon road would have guessed it was a failed root cellar or an abandoned cattle shelter. It did not look like a house. Inside, the difference was immediate. During a December blow that sent snow sideways across the divide, Ragna placed a pinch of flour dust along the base of the rear wall and watched it. In Alma's frame cabin, she knew flour dust would jump and scatter with every gust that pressed through the cracks. Here, the flour sat still. The wind was outside. The stove flame bent slightly in the draft from the shutter gap, but it did not flicker and it did not reverse. Ragna measured what she could. Inside temperature before dawn, with one small stove load banked overnight, 38 degrees. She did not own a thermometer. She used a pan of water and marked where the surface began to freeze. Alma reported frost forming on the inside of her cabin's nail heads, which meant the interior of the Ketchum cabin dropped below freezing before morning. Ragna's walls did not frost. The earth held heat the way her mother's byre had held it, not hot, but steady, the temperature of the ground itself, which did not swing with the air above. She tracked fuel use. In 3 December days, she burned 1/3 less wood than Alma reported using for the same period in a cabin of similar size. The sod walls and earth cover were doing what the physics demanded, insulating the interior from the wild temperature swings outside. But Ragna did not celebrate. She marked the charcoal lines on the posts each morning. One line dropped 1/8 of an inch after a heavy wet snow. Halvor examined it and said that was acceptable settling. The clay layer was compressing as designed. Asa Whitcomb stopped by on December 10th. He walked the exterior, tapped the roof sod with his cane, and studied the low windward edge where the structure met the ground. He came inside and stood under the beam and looked at the charcoal marks. "It is standing," he said. His tone suggested that he had expected otherwise. But acceptable is not safe. An 1/8-inch sag in good weather means a 1/4 inch under load, and the load that matters has not arrived. He left without saying what the load was. Everyone on the loot divide knew what he meant. The settlement still doubted. Rusk told customers at Stover's store that the Brika house held heat because graves hold heat too. Alma remained torn. She respected Rana's numbers. She saw the flower dust sitting still along the wall, but she could not shake the image of children growing up in a dark, low room that smelled of earth. Knut Vik brought a hinged iron collar for the stovepipe junction and asked nothing in return. When Ragna tried to pay, he said, "Call it an investment in evidence." December passed. January arrived. The cold deepened, but the storms held off. The divide sat under blue skies and hard frost, and the settlers did their winter work, feeding stock, mending tools, burning fuel, waiting. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, the weather broke, not toward cold, but toward warmth. The temperature rose from below zero to above freezing by mid-morning. Snow softened. Black grass appeared on south-facing slopes. Children went to school in light wraps. Women opened doors and stood in sunlight they had not felt in weeks. Halvor Tveit arrived at Ragna's door at noon. He had walked from his camp near the South Loop, 4 miles, at a pace that said something was wrong. His coat was open. He was sweating. He was not smiling. "Bar the east door before sundown," he said. "Fill every water vessel. Bank the stove now while you can still get wood without fighting for it. And do not let Eli leave this house." Ragna looked past him at the sky. To the south and east, the blue was deep and gentle. To the northwest, the horizon had disappeared. A line of black-blue cloud sat on the edge of the world like a wall built from bruised iron, and it was moving. "How long?" she asked. "Hours," Halvor said. "Maybe less." Eli was at Alma Ketchum's cabin, a half-mile east. Ragna had sent her that morning to return a borrowed needle and thread. She was not at the school. She was at Alma's. But Alma's cabin was a frame structure with a peaked roof and shingle cover and cracks in the west wall that whistled in a strong wind. "I need to get Eli," Ragna said. "You have time," Halvor said, "but not much. Go now and come straight back. I will stay with the boy." Ragna ran. She had not run in months. Her body was a construction tool now, made for lifting and carrying, not for speed. But she ran, and the warm January air felt wrong on her face, like a lie told in a friendly voice. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. At 1 o'clock, the northwestern sky turned black from the ground to the top of the visible world. The warm wind stopped. For a span of perhaps 30 seconds, the air on the Loo Divide went completely still. No sound, no movement, nothing. Birds dropped out of the air and sat in the grass. The cow pressed against the lean-to wall and would not move. Then the wind hit. It did not build. It arrived at full force, a wall of snow and cold air moving across the open tableland with nothing between it and the Arctic to slow it down. The temperature dropped so fast that the moisture in the warm air froze instantly, creating a white blindness that reduced visibility to less than an arm's length. Ragna was on the path between Alma's cabin and her own, 300 yards from her door, with Eli gripping her hand. She could not see the house. She could not see the ground. She could see Eli's face, pale and wide-eyed, and she could see her own hand, and beyond that the world was a white roar that erased everything. Ragna dropped to her knees. The wind was at her back, northwest, which meant the house was ahead and to the left. She had walked this path 100 times. She knew the ground. She crawled forward with Eli pressed against her side, counting paces by feel, her free hand sweeping the grass ahead for the sod-wing wall that guarded the east door. The cold came through her coat in seconds, not the gradual chill of a winter night, but an assault, a physical weight that pressed heat from her body the way a hand wrings water from cloth. Eli whimpered. Ragna pulled her closer and kept crawling. Her hand struck sod, the wing wall. She felt along it to the corner, found the door frame, and pulled Eli through. Halvor grabbed them both and pulled them inside and shoved the door shut against the wind. Inside, the sound changed. The roar did not stop, but it transformed. Outside, the wind was a scream, a high, unbroken note that came from every direction at once. Inside, the sound was deep and low, a pressure wave that moved across the roof like a slow hand pressing a drum skin. The sod cover absorbed the high frequencies. The earth muted the assault. The wind was present, but it was no longer violent. It was translated. Raw force filtered through 2 feet of sod and packed clay until what remained was a vibration felt in the chest, not a sound heard in the ears. Ragna stood in the center of the shelter and listened. Her heart hammered. Eli pressed against her waist. Peter sat on the pallet near the stove, wrapped in blankets, his eyes round and dark. Halvor stood at the door, his ear against the wood, listening to the wind the way a doctor listens to a chest. "The pipe," he said. Ragna looked at the stovepipe. It trembled in Knut's iron collar, vibrating with the wind pressure outside, but the collar held. The pipe did not sway. The joints did not separate. The draft pulled upward, weakly, but upward, which meant the wind was not forcing itself down the chimney. The slope of the roof was deflecting the current above the pipe opening instead of driving it into the flue. Outside, in Alma Ketchum's frame cabin, the situation was different. Ragna could not see it, but she would learn the details later, and they would confirm everything the flour dust and the smoke twist had promised. The wind hit Alma's west wall square. The wall was pine boards nailed to a frame, with batting stuffed between the studs and a layer of tar paper on the outside. The wind pressed through the cracks between the boards, not through gaps, but through the wood itself, driving snow crystals into the batting until the insulation became a sheet of ice. The temperature inside dropped below freezing within 30 minutes. The stovepipe, braced with wire but not collared with iron, tore loose from the roof jack when a gust caught the exposed section above the ridgeline. Smoke filled the cabin. Alma opened the door to clear the smoke, and the wind slammed it against the wall and ripped one hinge free. Alma's oldest boy, Thomas, 14, told his mother he was going to the Breka cabin because the Breka cabin was closer than the schoolhouse, and its walls did not have cracks. Alma said no. Thomas said the stovepipe was down, and the children were freezing. Alma wrapped the youngest two in every blanket she had and told Thomas to take the rope from the cow tether and tie one end to the door frame. Thomas went out with 30 yards of rope. He made it 20 yards before the white closed around him and the ground disappeared and the wind pushed him sideways and he could not tell which direction he was moving. He crouched behind a sod block that had fallen from somewhere, a piece of Ragna's reserve stack, trampled and scattered, and held the rope and shouted into the wind. Inside Ragna's shelter, Halvor heard the shout. Ragna heard it a moment later, thin, broken, coming from the windward side, which meant someone was between the house and the storm and had no protection. That is the Ketchum boy, Halvor said. Ragna pulled Oddmund's freight rope from the peg beside the door. She tied one end around her waist and gave the other end to Halvor. Do not let go, she said. If I pull 3 times, pull me back. She opened the east door. The wind hit the wing wall and curled around the corner, but the wing wall took the worst of it. Ragna stepped into the lee and moved along the south side of the shelter toward the windward edge. Here the design proved itself in a way that had nothing to do with insulation or temperature. The roof sloped down to within 3 feet of the ground on the windward side. Ragna could crouch against the sod slope and move along it with the roof above her, shielding her from the full blast. She was not walking in the open. She was crawling along the side of a hill that happened to be her house, and the hill broke the wind above her head while she moved beneath it. She reached the low windward toe and called into the white. Thomas shouted back. He was 10 yards out, pressed against the ground behind the fallen sod block. Rana fed rope behind her and crawled forward. The wind was direct here, no shelter, no hill, just the full force of the plains blizzard driving ice crystals into her face until her cheeks went numb in seconds. She found Thomas by touch. His hands were bare. He had dropped his mittens somewhere in the white. She grabbed his coat and pulled him back along the rope, yard by yard, until they reached the low edge of the roof and the wind dropped to something survivable. They came through the east door together. Thomas collapsed on the floor beside the stove. Eli wrapped a blanket around his hands. Halvor shut the door and wedged it with a beam. How many still at Alma's? Ragna asked. 4, Thomas said through chattering teeth. The stovepipe is down. Mother sent me because the children... He stopped. His face was white with cold and red where the ice had scored it. How bad? The baby was not moving right. Ragna looked at Halvor. Halvor looked at the door. Outside, the wind screamed across the roof in a continuous, unbroken note that rose and fell like breathing. The charcoal marks on the posts stood steady. The walls did not shake. The stove drew. We cannot reach Alma's in this, Halvor said. No one can move in the open. The boy nearly died crossing 300 yards. Alma knows where we are, Ragna said. If the cabin fails, she will come here. If she can see to walk. She has a rope. They waited. The wind held. The temperature outside was falling. Halvor estimated 30 below zero based on how fast the snow in Thomas's hair had frozen to white crystal the moment he came indoors. The stovepipe trembled in its collar. The sod walls groaned once, a deep, slow sound that seemed to come from inside the earth rather than the structure, and then held still. Ragna checked the charcoal marks. No fresh sag. The beam was holding. At 3 o'clock, a pounding came at the east door. Halvor opened it, and Alma fell through with 2 children, her youngest boy and the baby, wrapped in a horse blanket that was already frozen stiff. Behind her, her second son pushed through and collapsed against the wall. Alma's face was raw from the wind. She had tied a flour sack over her head, and the sack was crusted with ice. The roof, Alma said. She was breathing in short, broken gasps. The west side shingles. They are gone. The wind found the edge and it peeled them back, and the snow is coming through the rafters. 9 people now occupied a space 16 by 20 feet. Ragna, Halvor, Eli, Peter, Thomas, Alma, and Alma's 3 youngest. The stove was too small for this many, but the bodies themselves were heat, and the sod walls held that heat, and the earth above them held it further. The temperature inside stabilized. Ragna checked her water pan. The surface was not freezing. The interior was holding above 32 degrees with 9 bodies and a banked stove. But Peter's cough had worsened. He had been fighting a fever for 3 days, and the stress of the storm, the noise, the pressure, the fear visible on every face around him, had broken something loose in his chest. He coughed until his face turned red and his body curled, and between the coughs he breathed in a high, thin wheeze that Ragnar recognized as the sound of a child whose lungs were tightening. Alma's baby was worse. The infant had been cold for too long during the crossing. His skin was pale, and his cry was weak, and he would not nurse. Alma pressed him against her chest inside her coat, and rocked and prayed while the wind moved across the roof above them like a hand testing the weight of what it could not lift. Halvor taught one last lesson under pressure. Rana wanted to stoke the stove high, to drive the temperature up, to warm the sick children, to push back the cold by force. Halvor stopped her. "Crack the east shutter," he said. "Not the windward seam, the east shutter. You need air moving through this room, or the smoke kills them faster than the cold. Bank the stove. Do not roar it. A small fire that burns all night is worth more than a hot fire that eats your wood by midnight. And keep the children low. Heat rises. The floor is the coldest place, but it is also the stillest. The air down there does not move, and still air holds warmth against a body better than moving air." Ragnar cracked the east shutter 1 inch. Cold air slid through, bitter, sharp, alive with the smell of snow and distance. But the draft pulled the stove smoke upward and out instead of letting it pool at ceiling height. The air in the room moved in a slow rotation, cold in from the shutter, warm up from the stove, smoke out through the pipe. Breathable, survivable. Through the long hours of the night, the storm continued. The wind did not slacken. Snow piled against the low windward toe of the roof, adding weight and insulation simultaneously. Ragna watched the charcoal marks by candlelight. One mark shifted, a hair's width, less than a 16th of an inch. And she held her breath until the beams settled and the mark stopped moving. The additional snow load was compressing the clay layer. The posts held. The iron straps held. The doubled cottonwood pair that Halvor had demanded and Ragna had resisted creaked once and went silent. Outside, across the divide, the blizzard was rewriting the landscape. Asa Whitcomb's cabin, a proper gable roof structure, well built with tight corners and good iron, lost a strip of shakes from the north ridge but held. Asa had overbuilt, and overbuilding saved him. But the Ketchum cabin lost a full section of its roof on the west side, the shingles peeling back one by one until the wind reached the rafters and the rafters began to flex. Rusk's lumber shed. The building he had stocked with the supplies he sold to other people lost its roof at the west edge, the boards lifting in sequence like pages turned by an enormous hand, scattering across the yard and into the drift line. Emery Vale, Rusk's hired man, was found at dawn behind the freight wagon, alive but frostbitten in both hands, curled against the wheel, with his coat pulled over his head. One neighbor's cow herd died where the snow and wind pinned them against a fence line, 32 animals frozen standing up. At dawn, the wind eased, not stopped, eased, dropping from a scream to a moan to a steady push that still drove snow but no longer drove it through walls. Ragna opened the east door and looked out into a world she did not recognize. Snow had buried the low windward face of the roof until the house was a white slope emerging from a white ground. The stovepipe poked up from the drift like a single dark finger. The lean-to where the cow sheltered was half buried but intact. The cow bawled from inside, alive, hungry, and furious. Ragna stepped out and looked at the roof. The sod cover was intact. The snow had piled over the slope, and frozen into a smooth, unbroken surface that looked like the hill it was meant to imitate. No edge had lifted, no board had peeled, no corner had caught the wind because there were no corners to catch. The wind had come looking for a wall, and it had found a hill, and it had done what wind does with hills. It had gone over. She went back inside. Halvor was sitting against the rear wall with Peter sleeping against his chest. The old man's face was gray with exhaustion. He looked at Ragna and nodded once. "The marks," he said. She checked them. Every charcoal line on every post was within a 16th of an inch of where it had been drawn. The beam had not sagged. The posts had not bowed. The roof that Asa had called insufficient, that Alma had called a cave, that Rusk had called a grave, and that Emery Vale had called a mole hole, that roof had held through the worst storm to hit the Nebraska plains in living memory. It had held while roofs around it failed. It had held because the wind could not find an edge, and without an edge the wind had no purchase, and without purchase the wind was just weather passing over ground. Ragna stood under the beam and pressed her palms against the sod wall. It was warm, not from the stove, from the earth. Alma looked up from the baby who was nursing now, weak but alive. She looked at the walls. She looked at the roof. She looked at Ragna. "Tell me about the drainage trench," Alma said. "The one behind the high wall. Tell me how you built it." It was not an apology. It was something better. It was a question. Asa Whitcomb came to the Breaky Claim on the morning of January 14th, 2 days after the blizzard broke. He'd spent the intervening time repairing his own roof, the lost strip of shakes on the North Ridge, and checking on 3 families east of his property who had sheltered in dugouts and come through alive but shaken. He walked slowly. The snow was knee-deep in the draws and crusted hard on the ridges, and his bois d'arc cane punched through the crust with every step. He expected a collapse. He had built enough structures on the Loop Divide to know what storms did to unconventional construction, and the Brecka shelter was unconventional in ways that made his carpenter's mind itch. Sod roofs failed. He had seen them fail. The weight of wet earth on insufficient beams, the settling that accelerated under snow load, the freeze-thaw cycle that cracked walls from inside. These were not fears. They were his professional experience, gathered over 11 years of building and burying on the Nebraska plains. He found Ragna chopping frozen snow from the east doorway with a spade. The snow had drifted against the leeward wing wall during the storm and frozen into a solid mass that sealed the door shut. She had been working for an hour. Behind her, inside the shelter, Eli was feeding the stove while Peter slept on the pallet, his cough quieter now, his fever broken sometime in the night. Asa stood at the edge of the cleared path and looked at the structure. The sod roof emerged from the snowfield like a natural feature of the terrain, a smooth, unbroken slope rising from ground level at the northwest edge to the rear bank cut at the southeast. Snow covered it in a uniform layer. No bare patches, no exposed boards, no shingle debris scattered downwind. The stovepipe rose from the rear like a dark finger, braced and steady, with a thin thread of smoke rising straight into the still, cold air. He walked the perimeter. He moved along the windward side, where the roof met the ground at its lowest point, and ran his hand along the sod edge. The snow had packed against it and frozen into a ramp that merged the roof seamlessly with the surrounding drift. He could feel the sod beneath the snow, intact, unbroken, the grass roots gripping the clay and sheathing below. No edge had lifted, no section had peeled. No corner had caught the wind, because there were no corners on this side of the structure. He came around to the east door and stepped inside. The shelter was dim. The south shutter admitted a pale rectangle of light that fell across the floor like a plank, but it was warm, Not stove warm, ground warm. The temperature difference between the exterior and the interior was so stark that his spectacles fogged the moment he crossed the threshold. Asa looked at the posts. He looked at the charcoal marks. He pulled a folding rule from his coat and measured the distance between each mark and the beam above it. He measured twice. He put the rule away and stood under the main beam for a full minute, looking up at the underside of the roof sheathing, studying the way the cottonwood poles sat in their purlins, the way the iron straps gripped the joints, the way the doubled posts stood plumb beneath the load. I said corners hold a house, Asa said. He did not look at Ragna. He looked at the beam. I was wrong about what needed holding. That roof had fewer corners for the wind to find, and what the wind cannot find, the wind cannot take. Ragna set down the spade. She did not ask him to repeat it. She did not thank him. She waited. Your posts are sound, he continued. The marks show less than a 16th inch settling under full storm load, which is better than my own ridge beam managed, and my cabin has proper gable framing with iron at every joint. He turned to face her. I do not understand all of it. I do not understand why the temperature holds the way it does, or why the draft draws clean instead of backing under wind pressure. But I can see what I can see. And what I see is a structure that came through the worst storm I have witnessed in 11 years on this divide, with less damage than any frame cabin within 15 miles. He tapped the nearest post with his cane. Once, hard, the way he had tapped the crumbling sod on his first visit. The post rang solid. The beam above it did not move. What do you need repaired? He asked. One sod block on the east side cracked during the freeze. The stovepipe wire needs retying, and I need to dig out the doorway. That is your full repair list. That is my full repair list. Asa looked at the list the way a man looks at a bill that is smaller than he expected, not with relief, but with the uncomfortable recognition that his calculations had been wrong. The Ketchum cabin needed 12 roof boards replaced, 2 rafters sistered with new timber, and a full stovepipe rebuild. Rusk's freight shed had lost a third of its roofing. 3 families east of the divide had lost livestock shelters entirely, and Ragna Breka needed 1 sod block and a piece of wire. He left without saying more. At the edge of the claim, he turned and looked back at the shelter, the dark wedge emerging from the white ground, the smoke rising, the woman standing in the doorway with the spade in her hand. He looked at it for a long time. They came in 1s and 2s over the following week, not to gawk, to measure. Alma came first on the afternoon of the 14th, after her oldest boys had patched the worst gaps in her roof with salvaged boards and horse blankets. She brought her second son and a piece of charcoal and a flatboard, and she asked Ragna to show her the drainage trench. Ragna took her around the back of the shelter and dug through the snow until the trench was visible, the gravel, the broken crockery, the willow brush, the sloped clay beneath the sod layer that directed water away from the rear wall. Alma crouched beside it and studied the layers the way she studied a recipe. Each component necessary, each one in the right order, each one doing a job that the others could not do alone. How deep? Alma asked. 2 feet, 1 foot wide, gravel at the bottom, crockery and brush above, clay cap. And this is what keeps the water out. This is what keeps the water from reaching the wall. The sod stops the rain. The clay under the sod moves the melt. The trench catches what the clay misses. 3 layers between the sky and the room. Alma drew the cross-section on her board. She wrote the measurements beside each layer. She did not apologize for her earlier doubts, and Ragna did not expect her to. Alma had been right to worry about damp. Damp was the real enemy, the patient enemy, the one that came after the wind had finished. The drainage system was the answer to Alma's fear, and showing it to her was the only response that mattered. Knut Vik came on the 16th. He brought a forged iron bracket he had made during the storm, a hinged collar designed to fit a standard stovepipe at the roof junction, with a flange that sealed the gap where the pipe passed through the sheathing. He had made it because his own stovepipe had shifted during the blow, and he had solved the problem for himself and then made a second one for Ragna because the principle was the same. He examined the shelter with the quiet, systematic attention of a man who works with metal and understands load. He pressed his palms against the posts. He sighted along the beam. He crawled along the outside of the low windward toe and ran his fingers along the seam where sod met ground. The iron straps held, he said when he came back inside. Every one, Ragna said. I forged them for a stock shelter. I did not expect them to hold a house through that wind. They held because Halvor made me double the posts. The iron carried the lateral force. The posts carried the vertical. Neither alone would have been enough. Knut looked at the bracket assembly at the beam junction. 2 iron straps crossing at right angles, spiked into the post, and bolted through the beam, with a diagonal brace running from post base to purlin. It was crude work. The iron was salvaged. The bolt holes did not quite align, but it was sound, and it had held under a load that had torn milled lumber from Rusk's freight shed. I can make these better, Knut said. Cleaner joints, pre-drilled holes, a standard size that fits a 6-inch post and an 8-inch beam. Why? Because other people are going to want them. He was right. Ragna did not perform a demonstration. She did not give a speech. She let people come and look and ask, and she answered their questions with the specificity that Halvor had taught her. Not opinions, but measurements. Roof pitch, sod thickness, drainage depth, post spacing, iron weight at each joint, fuel use per week compared to a frame cabin of similar size. She made one concession to demonstration. When a group of 4 men came from Homestead south of the Divide, strangers who had heard about the shelter that survived, she took them outside and showed them the flour dust test. She set a square sod block upright on the frozen ground and propped a flat board at the angle of her roof beside it. She threw a handful of loose snow at both. The snow hit the block and eddied behind it in a swirling pocket. The snow hit the sloped board and slid off clean. That is what happened to the wind, she said. It found a shape it could not grip. She showed them the drain trench. She showed them the inside of the wall, where Halvor's reversed grain sod courses locked together. She showed them the charcoal marks on the posts and explained what they measured and why. She showed them the place where Halvor had rejected her first post design and made her rebuild, and she told them that the rebuild had saved the roof during the storm. She did not mention Rusk. She did not mention the mockery. She showed the work and let the work answer. Dillard Rusk's reaction to the validation was not conversion. It was calculation. Within a week of the blizzard, Rusk understood that the Brecka shelter had become a problem for his business. Not because the shelter itself threatened him. One sod wedge on one widow's claim did not reduce his lumber sales. The threat was the idea. If settlers believed they could build wind-resistant shelters from sod, clay, and salvaged iron, they would buy less milled lumber, fewer nails, and no tarred felt. They would not need his credit terms. They would not fall into debt. And settlers who did not fall into debt did not sell their claims to Dillard Rusk at distressed prices. He tried to recast the design as luck. At Stover's counter, within earshot of anyone buying coffee, he said the Brecka house had survived because it was small, not because it was shaped right. He said any dugout would have done the same. He said the real test would come in spring, when the melt turned the roof into a mudslide and the whole thing caved. When that argument failed to gain traction, people had seen the drainage trench. People had measured the temperature inside. Rusk tried a different approach. He told 3 homesteaders on the South Divide that he could build them a storm wedge based on what he had observed from the road. He would supply the lumber framing, the sheathing, and the tarred felt at a package price. He would add a sloped sod cap on top. It would look like the Brecka design and carry the Brecky reputation, and it would be built by a man who understood construction. Ragna learned about this from Knut, who had heard it from a customer at the forge. She said nothing for a day. Then she walked to Asa Whitcomb's property and asked whether she could use his yard for a teaching day. A teaching day, Asa repeated. I want to show people how to build the drainage system, the post bracing, and the roof slope, not the simple version, the version that works. If Rusk sells people a sloped cap on a frame cabin without the trench, without the reversed grain sod, without the clay underlayer and the doubled posts, it will fail. And when it fails, people will say the design failed, not the builder. Asa studied her for a moment. You want to give the method away. I want to give the method away before someone sells a broken version of it and kills a family. Asa offered his yard. Ragna taught 12 people on a cold February afternoon, standing beside a half-built demonstration wall that she and Halvor had assembled from spare sod blocks. She showed the sod selection, pulling roots, testing grip. She showed the laying pattern, grass down, reversed grain, settling gaps. She showed the drain trench in cross-section, using a shallow pit she had dug that morning. She showed the post bracing, using an actual doubled post assembly that Knut had brought from his forge. She taught the way Halvor had taught her, through action and material and the weight of things held in the hand. She did not lecture, she showed. And when Asa asked a question about roof pitch that she could not fully answer from memory, she said, I do not know. Halvor would know. Ask him when he is well enough to stand. Because Halvor was no longer standing. Halvor Tveit had helped repair the Ketchum roof in the days after the blizzard. He had climbed onto Alma's cabin on January 15th, a cold, clear day with a north wind that cut through clothing, and worked for 6 hours replacing the sheathing boards that the storm had torn free. He was 62 years old, and he had spent the blizzard night sitting against a sod wall in a room with 9 people and a stove that he had deliberately kept low, and he had not slept, and he had not eaten enough, and the cold had settled into his chest the way water settles into a crack. He coughed on the 16th. By the 18th, the cough had a sound that Ragna recognized, wet, deep, rattling, the sound of lungs filling with what lungs should not fill with. By the 20th, Halvor could not walk from the Breka shelter to the privy without stopping twice to lean against the wall and breathe. Ragna moved him to the pallet near the stove. She kept the fire steady, not hot, not cold, the temperature that Halvor himself had taught her to maintain. She made broth from the cow's milk and dried venison that Alma had brought. Eli read to him from a Norwegian Bible that Halvor carried in his pack. Peter sat beside the pallet and held the plumb bob, turning it in his hands, watching the brass weight spin. Halvor did not give a deathbed speech. He was not that kind of man. On the 23rd of January, while Ragna was packing fresh clay into a crack on the south wall, he said her name. She came to the pallet. He was propped against the wall, breathing in the shallow, measured way of a person who is rationing air. The school, he said. When they build the school, tell them the entry must face away from the prevailing wind, and the drain must go behind the high wall, not beside it. Beside it freezes. Behind it, the bank shelters the gravel. I will tell them. And the boy. He looked at Peter, who was sleeping now with the plumb bob clutched in his fist. He draws barns on the flour sack with charcoal. The barns have sloped roofs. He sees it. Halvor closed his eyes. He breathed for another hour, each breath shallower than the last. each exhalation carrying a little more of the sound that living lungs make and a little less of the rattle that had settled there. He died in the early afternoon with the stove drawing clean and the wind moving across the roof above him without finding a way in. Ragna buried him on the rise 30 feet from Oddmund's grave. She used Halvor's own plumb bob to set the cottonwood marker vertical. She pressed the earth down with her hands the way he had pressed sod blocks into place, firmly, without wasted motion, with respect for the weight of what she was handling. The sun was low, and the light was the pale gold of a January afternoon, the kind of light that touches everything without warming it. Ragna stood beside the grave and looked south across the divide, where the land rolled in long, snow-covered waves toward the river breaks, and the wind moved across the surface of the snow the way it moved across the surface of her roof, steady, patient, indifferent to grief. She had learned from him how to read the grip of a root, how to judge the weight of wet earth, how to frame a joint that held under load, how to bank a fire that lasted, how to crack a shutter for air without inviting the storm inside. She had learned these things not from lectures, but from standing beside him while he did them, and now he was in the ground, and the knowledge was in her hands, and the hands would have to be enough. She went back inside and checked the charcoal marks. True. Spring came late and mean in 1888. March brought 2 false thaws that melted the top layer of snow and refroze it into an ice sheet that sealed the prairie like glass. April brought 3 days of cold rain that fell on frozen ground and had nowhere to go. The water ran downhill across the ice layer, pooling in draws and depressions, and every structure that sat in a low spot or lacked drainage filled from below. Ragna's shelter held. The drainage trench behind the high wall caught the meltwater and channeled it away through the gravel and willow brush. The sloped clay under the sod roof directed runoff toward the low windward toe, where it dripped off the edge and soaked into ground that was not the floor. The interior stayed dry, not comfortable. The smell of damp earth was constant, and the south shutters stayed open for hours each day to ventilate, but dry. No mud dripped from the ceiling. No water pooled on the floor. Alma, who had feared exactly this, came and checked and found nothing to confirm her fear. But in the 3rd week of April, the thing that Halvor had warned about happened to someone who had not listened. The settlement school sat 1 mile east of Ragna's claim, in a frame building with a sod addition that Rusk's hired builder had constructed the previous autumn as a storm shelter for the children. The addition was a crude version of Ragna's design, a sloped sod cap over a timber frame, bermed on the north side, with a low entry on the south. Rusk had sold the lumber and the plan. His builder had done the work. The builder had skipped the rear drainage trench. He had used shallow-rooted grass cut from the wash bottom. He had not reversed the sod grain. He had not sloped clay under the sod layer because clay work was slow and Rusk paid by the job, not the hour. And he had framed the roof with single posts, undoubled, unbraced, with no iron straps at the beam joints. 3 days of rain on frozen ground filled the earth around and above the school addition with water that had nowhere to go. The sod cover, cut from weak grass, absorbed the water like a sponge. The weight on the roof increased by half again. The single posts, never adequate for the load, began to bow. On the morning of April 21st, Ragna was walking to Stover's store when she passed the school and heard a sound. Not a crack, a groan, low, slow, continuous, the sound of wood bending past the point where it wanted to stop. She looked at the sod addition and saw a dark line of water running from the base of the north wall. Muddy water. Water that should have been above the roof but was coming through the wall instead, pushed by the weight of saturated sod pressing down on a structure that was failing from the top. She went inside. 14 children sat at benches. The teacher, a young woman named Clara Stensland, stood at the front with a spelling book. Water dripped from the ceiling near the stove hole, a steady, brown drip that had already formed a puddle the size of a dinner plate. Clara had placed a bucket under it and was teaching through the sound of dripping. Ragna looked up. The main beam was bowing. She could see it. A curve where there should have been a line, a sag of perhaps 1 inch, maybe more, visible to her eye because Halvor had taught her what straight looked like, and everything that was not straight was a warning. "Everyone out," Ragna said. Clara looked at her. The children looked at her. One of the older boys, Thomas Ketchum, Alma's son, who had nearly died in the blizzard crossing, stood up without being told. "The beam is sagging," Ragna said. "The weight above it is more than it was built to hold. Everyone out, now, through the south door. Move." Clara did not argue. She had been in the Breka shelter during the blizzard. She had seen what Ragna saw, and she had seen what Ragna built, and she did not question a woman who read beams the way other people read weather. The children filed out. Thomas carried the 2 youngest. Clara grabbed the spelling book and the attendance ledger. Ragna stood under the bowing beam and watched the sag increase by a visible fraction while the room emptied, a slow, steady descent that compressed the air beneath it and sent a second drip of muddy water through a new crack in the sheathing. Everyone was out within 2 minutes. Ragna left last. She did not wait for someone else to fix it. She went to the nearest homestead and borrowed 2 wagon jacks, heavy iron screw jacks used for lifting axles, and brought them back to the school. She crawled under the bowing beam and set the jacks on flat stones and cranked them up until they pressed against the beam on either side of the worst sag point. The beam lifted. The sag reduced. The dripping slowed. Then she went outside and dug. She cut a relief trench behind the north wall with the spade, working through heavy clay and gravel, opening a channel that allowed the trapped water to drain away from the structure instead of pressing against it. The water came out brown and fast, running downhill across the frozen ground in a stream that carved a path through the remaining ice. Knut Vik arrived within the hour, called by Thomas, who had run to the forge. Knut brought iron and tools. He punched drain holes through a packed clay lip at the base of the north wall, allowing water that had pooled inside the wall to escape. He forged 2 temporary brace plates and spiked them to the beam where the jacks held it, reinforcing the weakest section. The roof did not collapse. The children were not inside when the worst of the sagging occurred. Nobody was hurt, but the distance between nobody was hurt and the beam crushed 14 children was measured in the minutes it took Ragna to recognize what she was seeing and say 2 words: "Everyone out." If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The aftermath of the school scare did what the blizzard could not. It turned the settlement's attention from whether Ragna's design worked to whether Rusk's imitation of it could kill. Asa Whitcomb inspected the school addition the following day. He measured the post diameter, the beam span, the sod thickness, and the absence of every feature that made Ragna's shelter sound: no drainage trench, no reversed grain sod, no clay underlayer, no iron bracing, no doubled posts. He wrote his findings in a letter that he read aloud at a gathering at Stover's store. "The principle is sound," Asa said. "The execution was not. Every feature that Mrs. Breka's shelter has, the school addition lacks. The builder skipped the drain, used weak sod framed with single posts, and put no iron at the joints. This was not a failure of the design. This was a failure of the man who sold it. He did not name Rusk. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew who had supplied the plan and the lumber and the builder. Rusk was in the room. He stood near the door with his hat on, his arms folded, his face controlled. When Asa finished, Rusk said, "The design is Mrs. Brecka's. If it fails when built by anyone else, that suggests it requires unusual skill, not that my builder was at fault." Asa turned to him. "Your builder skipped the drainage trench. That is not a lack of skill. That is a decision to save time at the cost of safety. The trench is not optional. It is the reason the roof does not collapse in spring. My builder was not given instructions about a trench. Then your builder was given an incomplete plan, and you sold it as complete." The room was silent. Rusk looked at the faces around him. Men he had sold lumber to, women he had extended credit to, families whose claims he had quietly assessed for purchase value. He saw no allies. He saw people who had sheltered their children in a building he had supplied, and that had nearly fallen on those children's heads. He left without speaking again. The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled. Ragna, who had been standing near the back wall, did not speak either. She did not need to. The school's near failure had said everything about the difference between understanding a design and copying its appearance. She had built the bones. Rusk had sold the skin. The bones held. The skin tore. That evening, Knutvik came to the shelter. He brought a set of forged pipe collars, 3 of them, each sized for a standard stovepipe, each with the hinged flange he had designed during the blizzard. He set them on the table Ragna had built from packing crates. "These are for whoever builds next," he said. "I am making them at cost, $1.20 each. If they cannot pay, I will take labor." "You are going to run out of iron," Ragna said. "Then I will buy more iron. There is a salvage yard in Grand Island." They sat in the shelter while the evening light came through the south shutter and fell across the floor. Peter was asleep on the pallet with the plumb bob beside his head. Eli was reading by the stove. The walls were warm. The roof was silent. "Halvor said Peter draws barns with sloped roofs," Ragna said. Knut nodded. "I have seen them, on the flour sack. The boy draws them with the low side facing the same direction every time. Northwest. He knows which way the wind comes." Ragna looked at the charcoal marks on the posts. They had not moved since the blizzard. The lines Halvor had drawn were becoming part of the wood now, darkened by stove smoke and the oil of hands that checked them every morning. She would keep checking them. She would teach Eli to check them. She would teach anyone who built this way to draw their own marks and read them the way Halvor had read the plumb bob, with patience, with attention, and with the understanding that the truth of a structure was not in how it looked, but in whether it moved. She had 12 people who had attended the teaching day at Ussa's yard. She had Alma, who was already sketching a storm cellar with a sloped sod cap. She had Knut, who was forging iron at cost. She had Asa, who had reversed his judgment publicly and was sending new settlers to Ragna's door. She had no mentor. She had no husband. She had $9.40 and a cow and a lame ox and 2 children and a notebook where she had started recording measurements: roof pitch, drain depth, post spacing, fuel use, interior temperature, charcoal mark readings, in the careful hand of a woman who understood that the next person to build this way would need numbers, not stories. And she had Rusk, who had retreated but not conceded, who had been humiliated by a school roof but not converted by a blizzard, who still controlled the lumber supply, the freight contracts, and the credit terms that most settlers on the Loop Divide depended on. Rusk was not finished. Rusk was recalculating. The wind moved across the roof and kept going. Ragna banked the stove and closed the shutter and lay down beside her children in the dark. Tomorrow she would begin drawing proper plans. Not ash sketches on a board, but measured diagrams on paper, with dimensions and materials and the specifications that Halvor had carried in his hands and that she now carried in hers. The knowledge was hers now. The question was whether she could pass it forward fast enough to matter. By the summer of 1888, Ragna Breka had become something she had not intended to become. She had intended to survive. She had intended to prove the claim, raise the children, and endure long enough for the land office clock to run out and the 160 acres to become hers by law. She had not intended to become the person other people came to when they needed to understand how to build. But intention did not matter. Need did. And the need was specific. 3 families on the Lu Divide had decided to build some version of Ragna's windbank design before the next winter, and none of them knew how. The first was Alma Ketchum. She did not want a full wedge cabin. Her frame house was repairable. And her husband, when he returned from a freight run in May, patched the roof and sistered the damaged rafters with boards Asa Whitcomb donated from his lumber store. But Alma wanted a storm cellar, a place the family could retreat to when the wind turned killing and the frame house began to shake. She wanted it built into the slope behind her cabin, with a sloped sod cap, a leeward entry, and a drainage trench. Ragna walked the site with her. They chose a spot where the natural grade dropped 3 feet over 12, enough slope to seat the rear wall without excavating the full depth. Ragna brought her notebook. She had started the notebook in February, recording every measurement she had taken during and after the blizzard, interior temperature readings at dawn, fuel consumption per week, charcoal mark shifts under different snow loads, drainage flow rates during the April thaw. The notebook was not elegant. It was a freight ledger with numbers written in pencil between the columns where Odmund had once recorded shipment weights. But the numbers were precise, and precision was what mattered. She taught Alma the sod test first. They knelt in the grass above Alma's cabin and pulled roots. Alma learned quickly. She had farm hands and a farmer's eye for soil. She could feel the difference between the weak, shallow root mass near the wash and the dense, gripping mat on the high ground. She cut her first test block and held it overhead with both arms, and it did not crumble. "Heavy," Alma said. 40 pounds, Ragna said. "You will carry 300 of them." Alma built her storm cellar over 6 weeks, with Ragna checking progress every 3rd day. The drain trench went in first. Ragna insisted on that because Halvor had insisted on it, because water was more patient than wind, and the trench was the structure's immune system. Then the rear wall, seeded into the cut bank. Then the side walls, sod blocks laid grass down with reversed grain every 3rd course. Then the roof frame, 2 cedar posts donated by Asa, a single beam, and Perlin set at the pitch Ragna specified from her notebook. Knut Vik forged the iron brackets and strap plates. The tarred paper came from Ansley, not from Rusk. The storm cellar was finished by the end of July. It was 8 by 12 feet, too small for permanent living, large enough for 7 people and a stove during a 3-day blow. Alma tested it during an August thunderstorm that dropped 2 inches of rain in 4 hours. The drain trench ran full. The interior stayed dry. The sod cap shed the water in sheets that ran off the low edge and soaked into the grass beyond. Alma stood inside the cellar after the storm and pressed her palm against the wall. She held it there the way Ragna had held her hand against her mother's bier in hard anger, feeling the warmth, the mass, the stored energy of earth that the air could not spend. "You were right about the drain," Alma said. "Halvor was right about the drain. I am passing it forward." The second builder was Asa Whitcomb himself. He did not build a shelter. He modified his existing livestock shed, a timber frame lean-to on the north side of his corral, by lowering the windward eave, banking the north wall with sod, and digging a drainage trench behind the banked section. The modification took him 4 days. He worked alone because he was Asa Whitcomb, and he did not ask for help, but he consulted Ragna's notebook twice and sent Thomas Ketchum to the Bricky claim with specific questions about clay slope angles and iron spacing. The third builder was a young homesteader named Peter Solheim, no relation to Ragna's son, who had filed a claim on the South Divide in the spring of 1888. He was 24, unmarried, Norwegian-born, and he had arrived in Custer County with $60, a team of horses, and the memory of a cousin who had frozen to death in a frame shanty during the blizzard. He wanted to build his first shelter as a full wedge, Ragna's design, from bank cut to sod cap, with every feature intact. Ragna spent 3 days on Solheim's claim. She showed him where to cut sod. She showed him how to read the root depth. She showed him the bank cut technique, how to shore the sides with poles, how to slope the floor for drainage, how to leave the settling gaps above the frames. She showed him Halvor's reversed grain laying pattern and made him practice it on a test wall until his hands understood the rotation without his mind having to direct it. On the second day, she showed him something she had not shown anyone else. She showed him Halvor's plumb bob technique, hanging the brass weight from the main beam and reading the swing. If the bob hung true, the beam was level. If it listed, the beam was settling, and the direction of the list told you which post was taking the load and which was beginning to fail. She gave him a plumb bob, not Halvor's, which hung by Ragna's door and would stay there, but one Canute had forged from a lead weight and a leather cord. "Check it every morning," she said. "The beam tells you everything before the roof does. If the bob lists more than a quarter inch from true in any direction, brace that post before you sleep in the house again." Solheim built his wedge cabin in 9 weeks. It was rougher than Ragna's. His bank cut was shallower, his sod work less precise, his drainage trench narrower. But the bones were right. The posts were doubled. The iron was at every joint. The grain was reversed. And when the first autumn wind crossed the divide and hit the sloped roof, it went over. The school entry was rebuilt in September of 1888, the original sod edition, the one Rusk's builder had framed without drainage or bracing, was torn down to the foundation. Ragna designed the replacement. Asa framed it. Knut forged the iron. Alma organized the labor. Thomas Ketchum, who was 15 now and strong enough to carry sod blocks on his shoulders, worked every day for 2 weeks. The new entry faced east, away from the prevailing northwest wind, exactly as Halvor had specified in his last instruction. The drain trench ran behind the high wall, sheltered by the bank cut, where the gravel would not freeze as quickly as it would on an exposed side. The posts were doubled. The sod was buffalo grass from the high ground. The roof pitch matched Ragna's notebook specification. Clara Stensland, the teacher, asked whether the children could watch the construction. Ragna said yes. She explained the sod test to a row of children sitting on the grass. She showed them the root mat. She showed them the flour dust test. She let them throw snow at a square block and a sloped board and see the difference. Thomas showed them how to use a plumb bob. Peter Brecka, who was 5 now, stood beside Thomas and held the cord while the brass weight swung to true. Ragna did not plan this as a lesson. She planned it as a construction project. But teaching was what it became, because children asked questions, and she answered them, and the answers contained the physics of wind and weight and water, and the physics did not care whether the person learning it was 8 or 60. Dillard Rusk's final reckoning came in the winter of 1889, and it came not from Ragna, but from his own work. Rusk had built a new freight warehouse on the north side of Broken Bow in the fall of 1888. The warehouse was a timber frame structure, 40 feet long, with a conventional gable roof and board siding. But Rusk, who had watched the settlement's growing interest in sloped construction, had added a modification, a false sloped facade on the north face, made from angled boards covered with a thin layer of sod, designed to give the appearance of a wind-banked wall. The appearance, not the function. The false facade had no drainage behind it. The sod was decorative, not structural, a half-inch skin of weak grass laid over boards that were nailed to the gable framing at an angle. The boards created a pocket between the false face and the true wall, and that pocket collected moisture every time the temperature cycled through freeze and thaw. The moisture expanded as ice, pressing the angled boards away from the frame. The nails loosened, the sod cracked. By January of 1889, the false facade was separating from the building. The first serious wind of the new year did not destroy the warehouse. It peeled the false facade off the north wall in a single sheet, boards, sod, nails, and all, and deposited it in the road 30 feet south. The noise woke half of Broken Bow. The warehouse roof, now exposed on the north side without the false windbreak, caught the full force of the following gusts, and 2 rows of shingles lifted from the ridge and scattered. Rusk blamed the design. He told anyone who listened that the sloped construction principle was flawed, that it could not be adapted to larger buildings, that it was suitable only for small shelters built by people who had no other choice. He called it the widow's fashion, and said fashion had no place in commercial building. Asa Whitcomb inspected the damage. So did Knut Vik. So did Ragna, at Asa's request. They stood in the road, looking at the peeled facade lying in the mud, and Asa pointed with his cane at the gap where the false wall had separated from the true wall. No drainage, Asa said. No structural connection, Knut said. The sod was cosmetic. There are no iron ties between the angled frame and the gable frame. He nailed a picture of a wall to the side of a building. Ragna looked at the pocket between the false face and the true wall. She could see the ice damage, the swollen wood, the corroded nails, the frozen moisture that had been working for months to push the facade free. She could see exactly what Halvor would have seen. A man who had copied the shape of an idea without understanding the system beneath it. Drainage, root grip, iron at the joints, clay slope, doubled posts. These were not decorations. They were the reasons the shape worked. Without them, the shape was a costume, and the wind did not respect costumes. Rusk arrived while they were inspecting. He stood at the edge of the road with his hat on and his arms folded, and looked at the 3 of them looking at his failure. "I suppose you have an opinion," he said to Ragna. "I have a measurement," Ragna said. "Your sod was a half-inch thick. Mine is 4 inches. Your drainage was absent. Mine runs 2 feet deep behind the high wall. Your iron was nails. Mine is strap-plate at every joint where beam meets post. You built the look of it. I built the bones." Rusk stared at her. The silence between them was dense, with 3 seasons of mockery, obstruction, gouged prices, and cattle driven through sod stacks. He had called her house a mole hole. He had called it a grave. He had blocked her supplies and sold broken copies of her design and let his hired man trample her work. And now his own building had failed in the exact way Ragna's had not, for the exact reasons Ragna had been teaching people to avoid. "I sold the look of it," Rusk said finally. His voice was flat, not apologetic, not humble, just accurate. "She built the bones." He turned and walked back toward his warehouse. He did not shake Ragna's hand. He did not offer thanks. He did not become kind. But he stopped selling sloped construction plans, and he stopped calling the design the widow's fashion. And when a new settler asked him about wine-banked shelters, he said, with the careful precision of a man protecting what remained of his authority, "Talk to Mrs. Brecka. She knows the measurements." It was not a conversion. It was a surrender to evidence, On the loop divide, that was worth more than kindness. Through the spring and summer of 1889, Ragna refined the design through the failures she witnessed in other people's attempts. A homesteader 12 miles south built a banked wall without reversing the sod grain, and the wall split along a horizontal seam after the first freeze-thaw cycle. Ragna walked the site, diagnosed the failure, and showed the man how to rebuild with alternating grain. A family near Ansley dug a storm cellar with the entry facing northwest, directly into the wind, because they had heard about the sloped roof, but not about the leeward door. Ragna sat with them and drew the wind pattern on a board, showing how the entry must face away from the prevailing direction, how the wing wall must break what remained, how a door that fought the wind was a door the wind would eventually open. Each failure taught her something that success had not. She learned that the method was not a single design, but a system, a set of principles that had to work together or not at all. The slope without the drainage was a mudslide. The drainage without the iron bracing was a settling trap. The iron without the doubled posts was a joint waiting to fail. She began describing the system to new builders not as a house plan, but as a list of problems, each solved by a specific feature, each feature dependent on the others. The roof is not one thing, she told Peter Solheim when he came back with questions about a sagging purlin. The roof is the slope, the sod, the clay, the tar, the posts, the iron, and the trench. Remove any one of them, and the rest cannot compensate. They are not alternatives. They are partners. She wrote this in the notebook. It was the closest she came to philosophy, and it was not philosophy. It was engineering stated in plain language by a woman who had learned it by nearly losing everything she had. Knut Vik had been present at every stage since the day he sold Ragna salvage strap iron at Stover's store. He had forged the stovepipe collar that held during the blizzard. He had punched drain holes in the school wall. He had made brackets for Alma's storm cellar, strap plates for Solheim's wedge cabin, and a plumb bob from lead and leather that hung in a homesteader's house 20 miles south. He had done all of this at cost, and sometimes below cost, and he had never asked Ragna for anything except the answer to a technical question. Their partnership grew the way sod walls grew, one block at a time, each course laid on the one below it, each joint stronger than the material on either side. In the autumn of 1889, they began working together on a project that was neither his nor hers, a wind-banked stock shelter for a Norwegian family that had settled on the North Divide and lost their livestock shed in the blizzard. Ragna designed the shelter. Knut forged the hardware. They built it together over 3 weeks. Ragna laying sod, Knut setting iron, both of them covered in clay and grass, and the particular smell of turned earth that had become as familiar to Ragna as the smell of bread. On the last day of construction, while they packed the drainage trench behind the north wall, Knut asked where she thought the forge should go if they were to share a claim. Ragna did not look up from the gravel she was pressing into the trench. How large is the forge? 8 feet by 12, cast iron hearth, bellows on the south side. Then it goes on the east side of the house, leeward. The smoke rises away from the prevailing wind, and the heat from the hearth backs against the east wall and gives us warmth we do not have to burn fuel for. Knut set an iron strap into the beam joint above them and drove a spike through the bolt hole. That is not what I asked. I know what you asked. She looked at him. His face was streaked with clay. His hands were black with iron scale. He was looking at her the way he looked at a joint he was about to forge, with focus, with patience, with the knowledge that the next strike mattered more than the last. Leeward side, she said. Build it on the leeward side. They married in the spring of 1891 in a ceremony at the schoolhouse that Clara Stensland organized, and Alma Ketchum catered with plum preserves and cornbread and a cake that leaned slightly to one side, which Thomas said was appropriate because everything the Breckes built leaned to one side on purpose. Knut moved his forge to the east side of the Breckes shelter. He built a lean-to for it with a sloped sod roof and iron bracing at every joint. And the heat from the forge hearth did exactly what Ragna had predicted. It backed against the east wall and warmed the living space through 2 feet of sod without burning a stick of fuel. They did not become wealthy. Wealth on the Lou Divide was measured in survival, and survival was measured in winters past and children fed and cattle standing in the spring. By those measures, they were rich. Knut forged iron for every windbanked structure within 30 miles. Ragna kept her notebook, which grew from a single freight ledger to 3, each filled with measurements, sketches, drainage calculations, and the names of the families she had helped. Eli grew. She learned to read the plumb bob and to test sod roots by twisting a block until it held or crumbled. She learned mathematics from Clara Stensland and construction from her mother, and the particular skill of translating one into the other, turning a measurement into a wall, turning a number into a load-bearing fact. She became a teacher, not of construction, of everything. But she taught every class the flour dust test, because the flour dust test taught physics in a language that did not require the word. Peter grew. The boy who had drawn sloped barns on flour sacks with charcoal began drawing them on paper, with dimensions, with angles, with the roof pitch that his mother had determined through measurement, and his father, Knut, who became his father in all the ways that mattered, had built from iron and wood. The barns Peter drew had lowered windward faces and leeward entries and drainage trenches marked in cross-section. He was not an architect. He was a boy who had survived a blizzard at age 4 and who had carried a plumb bob in his fist while an old man died beside him. And the things he drew were the things he had learned before he had words for learning. By 1892, 7 families within 12 miles of the Brecka claim had some form of Ragna's wind-banked sod construction. 2 were full wedge cabins. 3 were storm cellars. 1 was a livestock shelter. 1 was the school entry where children still sat and watched the wind go over. Ragna's notebook recorded each one, its dimensions, its pitch, its drainage, its post-spacing, its performance through the season. She was not building a legacy. She was building a record. The record would outlast her, and the record would keep people alive after she was no longer there to check the charcoal marks. The community changed in the way communities change when knowledge replaces fear. New settlers no longer laughed first when they saw the dark wedge on the Brecke rise. They asked where the winter wind came from. They asked how deep the drain should be. They asked whether buffalo grass or blue stem held better in wet clay, and Ragna told them buffalo grass, and she told them why, and she showed them the root test, and she let them feel the difference in their own hands. Alma Ketchum became Ragna's most effective ambassador, though she would not have used the word. She taught women who came to the divide how to test sod roots by twisting a block in their hands until it either held or crumbled. She taught them the drain trench specifications from memory: 2 feet deep, 1 foot wide, gravel at the bottom, crockery and brush above, clay cap. Reciting the layers the way she recited recipes. Each component in its order, each one necessary. She taught them because she had doubted Ragna first and had been wrong, and being wrong had given her a specific kind of authority, the authority of someone who had tested the idea against her own fear and found the idea stronger. Children called her house the Hill House, not the Mole Hole, the Hill House. Asa Whitcomb, who had told Ragna on the 4th day after her husband's death that what he saw was not a house, sent every doubtful new builder to her door. "Talk to Mrs. Brecka," he told them. "She knows what the wind is looking for, and she knows how to not give it." The years compress the way years do when the work is steady and the ground stays solid underfoot. Ragna and Knut's claim proved out. The land office filed the final papers. The 160 acres that Oddmund Brecka had paid for with borrowed money, and his life became Ragnarvik's by law, by labor, and by the 5 winters she had survived on it. Knut's forge grew. He took an apprentice, Thomas Ketchum, who had nearly died in the blizzard, and who had carried sod blocks at 15, and who now, at 18, had arms that could swing a forge hammer for 8 hours without stopping. Thomas learned iron from Knut and sod from Ragna, and the combination of both from the work itself. Alma Ketchum's storm cellar survived 4 more winters without a leak. She expanded it in 1893, adding a ventilation shaft on the leeward side with a hinged cap that Knut forged from sheet iron. The cap opened in calm weather and sealed in wind. Ragna added the design to her notebook. Ragna herself added a summer vent to the main shelter, a raised opening on the east wall with a hinged cover that allowed hot air to escape in July and August, when the Earth's insulation worked against comfort instead of for it. The vent was Halvor's idea, mentioned once during the construction, filed in Ragna's memory, and built 2 years after his death with iron hinges from Knut's forge. She opened the vent on the first hot day of June and felt the trapped air rise and escape, and for a moment the shelter breathed the way a living thing breathes, taking in what it needed, releasing what it did not. Frame houses came. Milled lumber dropped in price as the railroad pushed closer, and competition eroded Rusk's monopoly. By the mid-1890s, most new construction on the Lou Divide was conventional timber framing with shingled roofs and glass windows and painted trim. The Saudis were replaced one by one as families earned enough to build the houses they had always wanted. But the storm cellars remained. The banked livestock shelters remained. The school entry, rebuilt with Ragna's specifications, stood for 19 years before the building itself was replaced, and the replacement kept the leeward entry and the drainage trench, because by then nobody remembered why those features existed. They just knew they worked. Ragna lived on the Breake claim until 1916. She was 60 years old. Eli had married and moved to Grand Island, where she taught school and kept a plumb bob on her desk that she used to demonstrate vertical and horizontal to children who did not know they were learning construction. Pater had become a carpenter in Broken Bow, and the barns he built had a distinctive profile, a lowered face on the windward side, a steeper pitch on the lee, a drainage trench behind the banked wall. People who hired him did not always know why his barns survived storms that flattened others. Peter knew. He had drawn it on a flour sack when he was 5 years old. Knut died in 1914 at the forge, doing what he had done every day for 30 years. His hands were on the hammer. The iron was in the fire. He fell without a sound, and Thomas Ketchum, who was working beside him, caught him before he hit the ground. Ragna lived 2 more years. She kept the notebook. She checked the charcoal marks every morning, though the marks had not moved in 25 years, and the wood they were drawn on had darkened with age until the charcoal was barely visible against the grain. She kept Halvor's plumb bob by the door. She kept the awl he had carried in his pack, a worn Norwegian tool with a birch handle smooth from decades of use. She used the awl to clear the drainage trench every spring, pushing gravel aside and testing the flow the way Halvor had taught her, with a cup of water poured at the high end and eyes watching the low end to see how long the water took to arrive. She died in the spring of 1916 after a wet April that kept her inside for 3 days. Her last practical act, The last thing she did that was not breathing or resting or holding Eli's hand was asking Peter whether the north drain had been cleared. He told her it had. She closed her eyes. The stove drew clean. The wind moved across the roof and kept going. Within 5 winters of the January 1888 blizzard, 7 families on the Lou Divide had adopted some part of Ragnar Brekka's method. They built lowered windward profiles and sod-banked walls. They dug drainage trenches packed with gravel behind their high walls. They hung plumb bobs from their beams and checked them every morning. They used pipe collars forged by Knut Vik and iron straps set at every joint where beam met post. The spread was local, 15 miles in any direction from the bricky claim, a circle drawn by the distance a woman could walk in a day to check someone's charcoal marks. It did not change American architecture. It changed how one settlement on the Nebraska plains looked at wind. Ragnar Brekka Vik lived her entire adult life on the 160 acres that Oddmund Brekka had filed and died for. She raised 2 children who carried the knowledge forward in their hands and in their work. She filled 3 freight ledgers with measurements that no one asked her to take and that no institution preserved, but that lived in the buildings her neighbors built and in the storm cellars their children sheltered in and in the drainage trenches that kept the water patient while the wind spent itself overhead. Halvor Tveit's plumb bob hung by her door for 29 years. It hung there after she died, until Peter took it down and put it in his toolbox beside his own, where the brass weight rested against a carpenter's rule and a Norwegian awl with a birch handle worn smooth by 2 pairs of hands. On the 12th of January, 1888, the sky above the Loop Divide turned black from the northwest, and the wind hit the Nebraska plains at speeds that tore roofs from cabins, drove cattle into fences, and killed men who stepped 10 feet from their doors. Dillard Rusk had called Ragnar's house a mole hole with a hat pulled over its eyes. Emery Vale had laughed from his wagon. Alma Ketchum had feared for the children growing in darkness. Asa Whitcomb had said that what he saw was not a house. And when the wind came, the real wind, the killing wind, the wind that found every edge and every crack and every corner that a square cabin offered, it reached the Brekka claim and found no wall. It found a hill. It found a slope of earth and grass and tangled roots that met the moving air the way the ground has always met the air, by letting it pass. Inside, a woman held her children, and a stove drew clean, and a plumb bob hung true from a beam that did not move. The house did not defeat the prairie. It learned which way the prairie wanted to pass,